So recently, over the past several months, Niantic made very controversial gameplay related decisions that have certainly rubbed Pokémon GO players the wrong way. This includes adding major nerfs to Incense, removing the increased interaction radius of Pokéstops and Gyms, and just overall, removing huge quality of life mechanics that have become a staple to Pokémon GO. All of these gameplay decisions were under the context that Niantic wants to make Pokémon GO all about exploration and outdoor play once again. Now, I firmly believe Niantic's approach to this goal is flawed, to say the least. Pokémon GO can be about exploring new areas and playing outdoors without having to take away some of the conveniences players have enjoyed for a long time. So that's what this video is going to be about. I'm going to explore how Niantic could retain their philosophy of exploration and outdoor play without gimping the current Pokémon GO experience. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let's jump right into it. The higher-ups at Niantic have never shied away from their intentions with Pokémon GO. The game's initial design has always been about utilizing the real world to give you a unique gameplay experience. At the start of Pokémon GO, this was not a new concept. Niantic's first major title, Ingress, had always used this gameplay model of utilizing the real world. But it wasn't until Pokémon GO where this form of augmented reality gameplay would become mainstream. In fact, this genre of games have exploded over the past several years as a result of Pokémon GO. Yet none have ever lived up to the amount of sheer dominance Pokémon GO has had on this genre, not even Niantic's other AR games. Thus, it makes absolute sense that Niantic would want to preserve what made Pokémon GO so successful in the first place. Having this game continue to be all about exploration and outdoor play means it would continue to be the game that has been so successful over the years. Otherwise, it would just be yet another Pokémon mobile game. This is also imperative for Niantic's survival as well, as the studio would need to generate revenue in order to stay afloat. Without a doubt, Pokémon GO is a money-generating machine, probably Niantic's only prime source of revenue. A major part of that revenue comes from sponsored Pokéstops and Gyms, while a substantial amount of their revenue likely comes from user purchases of in-game items. The higher value will always come from sponsors. They are basically the in-app advertisements of Pokémon GO. This would also motivate Niantic to encourage players not to play from home over extended periods of time. In order to continue generating that revenue, they would need players to go out and play and spin those sponsored Pokéstops. In Niantic's point of view, exploration and outdoor play is going to be the most important aspect of Pokémon GO. So with Pokémon GO being mostly designed around playing on the go, why did it change into a more indoor-friendly game? Well, in the early parts of the year 2019, the world would be rocked by the insane spread of COVID-19. This pandemic changed the very landscape of our daily lives. No longer was it considered safe to simply go outside and walk around. Most countries would implement lockdowns, curfews, and quarantine measures. People were forced to stay indoors for extended periods of time, and it was quite difficult to engage in any form of outdoor activities. Now, as a response to this, Niantic implemented several temporary gameplay measures that would allow Pokémon GO to be playable even in lockdown. If people are not able to go outside, it would essentially defeat the purpose of a game like Pokémon GO. If Niantic sat on their hands and did nothing, the engagement of the game would have declined to critical levels. This pandemic could have killed Pokémon GO. Of course, history would say otherwise. Niantic's quick response to adjusting the gameplay so that it was still playable even in a lockdown situation meant that people were still actively engaging with the game. What they did was that they added a laundry list of different bonuses to help players play from home, and the community would dub them the pandemic bonuses. You could get more Pokemon from Incense, you could receive items from Pokéstops and Gyms from a much farther distance, and you could even raid remotely through the introduction of the Remote Raid Pass. These are just a small handful of changes and bonuses Niantic made to the game in order to allow players to still enjoy it without having to go outside. But of course, Niantic made it very clear that they wanted these changes to the gameplay to be temporary. Once it was considered safer to go outside, they had full intentions to roll back several of these changes. And sure enough, that's exactly what they did. Over the past few months, Niantic began taking away bit by bit much of the various changes and bonuses that they added in response to the pandemic. Some bonuses remained, yet many others were removed with the hopes of encouraging players to once again go outside and play Pokémon GO the way it was always meant to be played. Of course, we the players should have seen this coming. Since Niantic were pretty vocal that such bonuses were temporary, we eventually reached that point where they would begin reverting Pokémon GO to pre-pandemic gameplay, as it was considered safer to be outdoors in most parts of the world. But here's the problem, one that I think Niantic failed to anticipate. Every Pokémon GO player got fully used to these temporary bonuses and gameplay changes, to the point where their daily engagement heavily relied on them. Certain pandemic bonuses like boosted Incense spawns, increased Pokéstop interaction distances, damage bonuses for remote raids, and friendship-related bonuses were all considered huge quality of life improvements to the general gameplay of Pokémon GO. One bonus especially was the increased Pokéstops and gym interaction distance. Many players lobbied to have them be permanent, especially because of the benefit these bonuses brought to disabled players and those who live in low-populated rural areas. Without question, the game did feel much better to play with these bonuses, even if you were playing outdoors. Several of the issues with the original gameplay were essentially solved through these bonuses, and more players were able to engage with the game. Yet, for some reason, Niantic decided to start removing most of them. As they took away pandemic bonuses, the gameplay started to feel archaic. Most of those quality of life improvements were starting to be recognized as essential, as various aspects of Pokémon GO felt much slower and less streamlined. It felt like a slow degradation of Pokémon GO. The rollback started off pretty slow, but it really came to a head with the removal of the increased interaction distance for Pokéstops and Gyms. That was the moment the Pokémon GO community made a stand. In what has got to be probably the most significant event in Pokémon GO's history, the Hear Us Niantic movement set a whole new precedent on how loudly the Pokémon GO community could voice their concerns. With the removal of the interaction distance bonus, nearly every Pokémon GO content creator and influencer banded together to send a message to Niantic that this one pandemic bonus needed to stay. While a back and forth dialogue did spawn with this movement, eventually the community's message was heard. Niantic reversed their decision to remove this bonus. Many players saw this as a major win for Pokémon GO. Niantic finally took an action based on the collective feedback from the community. While they always had a bad track record of listening to feedback, most players believed this was the first step in a long journey of building relations between Niantic and the Pokémon GO community. As someone who took part in the movement, it was pretty great to see Niantic respond swiftly and openly to our concerns. The narrative around the pandemic bonuses as a whole, however, did not change. In the most recent season, the season of Alola, Niantic began to roll back yet another pandemic bonus. This time, they readjusted Incense to be a lot less effective than they were while the pandemic was going on. While they didn't fully revert it back to its original pre-pandemic state, the changes to this item were most certainly felt by the community. Again, Niantic's reasoning for this change was no different than before. They wanted to encourage exploration and active outdoor play. I don't necessarily believe this particular change will merit another Hear Us Niantic movement. Many players will say that this change barely affects them at all. Yet, I'm hard-pressed to say that this is still not a good look for Niantic and Pokémon GO. When they boosted Incense during the pandemic, the item received incredible value, whereas it was hardly beneficial before. Using this item grants you a ton of spawns, making any purchases of this item feel justified and warranted. Yet with the big nerf, now it feels clunky and slow getting Pokemon from this item. Not only was this a huge blow to any player who still has to deal with lockdowns in their country, but this was an even bigger blow to any player who is bedridden or lives in a low populated area. Incense with the pandemic bonuses sort of leveled the playing field. You didn't need to drive to a big city in order to fill up your Pokédex. You didn't have to rely on having big cluster spawns of Pokémon around you in order to stock up on candy and Stardust. If you were stuck at home for whatever reason, you could still play the game in an enjoyable manner. Incense became a core item that many players used. But once Niantic nerfed them to near pre-pandemic levels, now players are feeling all of the problems that they had with the game before these bonuses. Incense no longer provides you as much benefit as they once did. Getting a large amount of Pokémon now will require you to be in a highly populated area, or lucky enough to be near giant cluster spawns. Whatever benefits this item provided you, it's now all gone. You see, this is the thing Niantic needs to think about, the player experience. If players are getting a huge benefit from an added bonus, and it's driving them to engage with the game more, it is probably in everyone's best interest that those particular bonuses remain in the game permanently. Now, I'm totally aware that these particular bonuses were intended to be temporary. I've stated as much throughout this video, but the bonuses provided a much better gameplay experience for pretty much every player, regardless if they were indoors or out. What I do want to say, however, is that rather than removing these pandemic bonuses in order to encourage exploration and outdoor play, Niantic needs to take a better approach. So, if Niantic were to keep the pandemic bonuses, how could they encourage players to go out and explore with their game? I think the alternative solution is rather simple. The absolute best course of action, in my opinion, would be to keep the pandemic bonuses and add additional forms of gameplay that would incentivize players to explore and play outdoors. One particular example was how Niantic rewarded Rare Candy XL during the Johto Tour event. While you were able to raid remotely during the event, being in the raid in person awarded you with various amounts of Rare Candy XL. The gameplay wasn't different for players choosing to play at home, but for players who were at the actual locations, they were given a significant reward for doing so. I believe this is the best approach for how Niantic could get players to explore and play the game like before. Add tantalizing incentives for players to actually go out and play rather than staying at home. Now, I'm not a game designer, but I'm sure there are plenty of ways Niantic could achieve this without making the gameplay too unbalanced. As with any game, there will always be a power creep. Players are going to get better and better, and the rewards are always going to be greater and greater. Rather than tuning down the gameplay to slow down that power creep, what they really should do is tune the gameplay upwards to keep up with it. I think this would be a much healthier way for the game to continue encouraging exploration and outdoor play without hurting the quality of life gameplay aspects that have become fundamental to the Pokémon GO experience. The landscape of Pokémon GO was drastically altered with the introduction of the pandemic bonuses. That is, the fortunate or unfortunate reality. The way Pokémon GO is played and how it feels to play is much different now compared to how it was before the pandemic. Some would argue that it's better. Others would say much of the difficulty and grindy aspects that made Pokémon GO so much fun have been lost. In my opinion, I think the game is in a bit of a Goldilocks scenario. The gameplay as it currently is, with some of the remaining pandemic bonuses still intact, feels just right to the average player. Going out and exploring feels rewarding, while choosing to stay at home doesn't feel punishing. No matter how you want to approach Pokémon GO, there's something in it for you. You can drive out and host raids, or you can sit on your couch and raid from home. These are the fundamentals that I do not want Niantic to remove now that the pandemic has somewhat subsided. What I proposed earlier regarding how Niantic could retain their philosophy of exploration-driven gameplay without the total removal of the pandemic bonuses is going to be tricky. Niantic will need to tread a fine line if they want to keep the Pokémon GO experience balanced and healthy. The last thing Niantic will want is for players who stay at home to have a huge advantage, or players choosing to play outdoors to have that advantage. I think if Niantic puts their collective minds into it, they can certainly encourage their players into playing Pokémon GO the way that they want them to play it, while not gimping the experience for those who wish to play the way Niantic wouldn't want them to play. Rather than removing player choice, my hope is that Niantic chooses to improve the player experience. Overall, everything I have said in this video is purely subjective. No two players will have the same Pokemon Go experience, and not everyone will have the same goals. Much of what I'm saying may not even apply to most players, but one thing is for sure, having an open dialogue with Niantic has done wonders for Pokemon Go, and I truly hope my feedback in this video, along with the feedback of many others, will continue to improve this game for years to come. Well, that's pretty much it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe if it's your first time here, and don't forget that little bell so you stay up to date on whenever I upload videos. And I want to give a quick shout out to my patrons on Patreon. You make this channel content possible. If you want to support my channel in any way, please consider visiting the Patreon link in the description below. And with that said, I am Count Jinsula. Be safe, have fun, love yourself, and I'll catch you all in the next one.